Growing Up Irooni interview with Marjan Kamali, author of The Stationery Shop. Marjan Kamali, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Me too. And yeah, I first found out about you actually because my mother is in a short story writing club. Or
Nice.
not club, I guess she's in a group, and they had invited you to speak, and she was like, I think you should come to this. It's going to be really wonderful. Hezar Osan in Dallas.
Oh, is that your mom was there? That's
Yes.
awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so they have this wonderful writing group, and they'd invited you, and she was like, I think you'll really enjoy it. And I came on, and I loved the conversation that you had, and you were so generous with your time and answering
Mhm.
their questions so patiently, and I was so excited to read your book. And that was what, 2 years ago or something? It was a while ago.
Yeah, that was a while ago, and I remember being so nervous for that conversation because it was conducted in Persian. For the
Right.
most part, I think, if my memory serves correctly, I did speak Persian, and I remember I was
Yeah.
so nervous, but they were so nice.
Yeah, and it was a wonderful conversation,
Mhm.
and I'd wanted to talk to you since then. We scheduled to talk in early September, but my daughter was being born that time, and I feel like it is fortuitous because just reading the book now meant such a different thing than reading it a couple years ago. Even I think it's just so timely after everything that's happened the past few months. So I can't wait to dive into it. And it is a book with a lot of spoilers and a lot of twists and turns. So I don't want to give too much away. So I thought we'd begin the conversation with you telling the audience who hasn't read it. I want everybody to read this book. Drop everything you're doing. It's so fun to read, so wonderful. And I should mention, I just reread it with a group of others in it's called Kitab Club NYC, which I encourage a lot of people to read too. But she said, Kimia, who leads the group, said that it was the number one requested novel. She's been asking for months for people to suggest what to read. She likes to read mostly like books by Middle Eastern authors, and this was the number one requested novel. And the discussions that we had were like therapy. I mean, people, I'm sure you get this all the time. They were just crying, telling about their families, their parents, their stories. It was really lovely to read it with them, and they were all a little bit younger, so they were talking about this for them was their grandparents' age,
Yes.
which I was like, oh, I'm way older than y'all. This is definitely
Yeah.
my parents.
Yeah, me too. My parents.
Ex-
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. And so anyway, so to go back and I just want to say I love the book. I really enjoyed it. It makes you feel like a child reading again because you can't
Oh,
put it down. It's one of
mhm.
those books where you want to get through to the very end. Don't interrupt anything and just read it. So I encourage everyone to read it. And having said that, if you want to tell us the kind of idea of the story.
Absolutely, absolutely. First of all, thank you again for having me on. This is just so special to me, considering how hard we tried and also everything that's happened since we initially were going to meet. But the stationery shop is a love story. It's about two teenagers who fall in love madly when they're 17, the way one does only when one is super young, I would say. And they have this whirlwind romance in Tehran in 1953. And then on the day that they're set to get their marriage certificate, they want to get married, the country erupts into a violent coup d'etat and they're separated. And even though Roya, our heroine, tries desperately to find Bahman, they don't succeed in reuniting until 60 years later in Massachusetts in an assisted living facility. And there are a lot of tears involved with this book on both my part
Definitely.
and the reader's part.
Yeah, I was wondering that. Were you just crying while you were writing the book? Was it?
I was crying so much. At one point
Yeah.
in the first draft, on my desk, I kid you not, there were like scrumpled up tissues, mountains of scrumpled up tissues, because there's a certain scene, and you've read the book, and I don't want to give it away, but that's what I consider the healing scene, where they finally get a little bit of closure after 60 years. And that scene, as I was writing it, I was crying. And I know that readers have been too, because they've let me know that.
Definitely. And I felt like, I mean, I feel like everyone in the group felt like they could personally connect with this story a lot. I mean, all of us are obviously kids of immigrants from Iran, and this is about the 1953 coup d'état, which I want to talk about. But I think a lot of us reference 1979 so much. But all these events in Iran had such huge uh, effects, ripple effects of like causing chaos in every family. And so my parents, for example, were not able to be together because of all these things as well. My father was a communist, became a refugee, went to London. My mother came to America. They weren't ever together again. And they kind of had this kind of love story as well, where they were these kind of star-crossed lovers. And also there was a lot of family things with them to not be together either, just like Roya and Batman. But for me, that was just reading it was really heartbreaking for me too, because at first, like you said, it's a 17-year-old love story. And I feel like for me, it's like, okay, you'll get over it. More things will happen. You'll meet other people. But really, uh, I feel like these outside forces really had such a huge effect on people's lives, and we all can relate to that in so many ways.
Absolutely. And, Roya's heartbreak, if you look at it on the surface, in the book, this character is suffering immense loss because she's lost her first love, her fiance, and they're super young and she misses him. But I think if you look at it on a deeper level, it's exactly all those things you said. She's lost her country. She lost the country she once knew. And it coincided for her with the loss of her first love, but so much of the heartache that she harbors for 60 years, I think she attributes maybe to the loss of this first love, but it's also the loss of not just her country, but her family, like you said. And I know we talk a lot about 1979, as we should. For people of my generation, that is the original wound. But for people of my parents' generation, 1953 played such a huge role in leading up to 79. But I think, regardless of which uprising you want to focus on, and sadly in Iran we have many, the biggest loss, people talk about politics a lot, people talk about, the effects of this on economics and all that. The biggest loss I think that we've all harbored is the loss of our families. We lost the ability to be within the network and safety of our extended families. And most of us had huge, extended social networks through our families. And to me, that's the biggest loss of the 1979 revolution. I can't speak to 1953 on a personal level, but I lost knowing my cousin, and I lost knowing my grandparents. And we all became siloed in these nuclear units if we were lucky. Like you said, I mean, even your parents were separated, and I know people very dear to me, my generation, who were separated from their parents for decades. So, yeah, that I think is the biggest shame.
That's such a good point. That's such a beautiful way to put it. And she did, Roya in the story comes to America and really she loses her sister, she loses her family, which actually that came up in the book club discussion of why couldn't her family be more involved with her? Like, why couldn't they just come visit? What was going on there?
That's a really good question, and I get asked that a lot at book clubs to the point that I'm beginning to think, methinks I should have explained that better. Um, you know what? I took it for granted that people knew that families evaporated and kind of disappeared off the page. In retrospect, I think I should have added a line or two saying when her parents could stop visiting so that the reader knew. But I think for me, because this was the lived experience of so many people I knew, I just assumed they did come to visit initially for Roya's wedding to Walter. They were there, they're present on the page. And then, like so many elderly parents who stayed in Iran and their children, emigrated to the West, They just, for the most part, stop seeing each other regularly. And we have an entire culture now of grandparents, let's say grandparents for the sake of your book club members, or in our case, maybe parents, but grandparents who their communication with their grandchildren is through iPads and FaceTime. And there's this, golden hour when it's evening in Tehran, or other cities in Iran, other places in Iran, and that's their communication. This distance, I think, is not uncommon.
Well, I did also wanna tell them, like, now there's iPads, but at the time, also, it was so expensive. Like, they were saying, "Why couldn't they just meet in another country?" Well, it was so expensive to do air travel. It's much more accessible now, and there were no iPads. Obviously, long distance calls were so expensive, so you really had to save up for even making a phone call. You couldn't just see each other either on a FaceTime.
Absolutely. And even if you were privileged enough to have the money, try getting that visa with an Iranian passport. Like that, in and of itself, is this entire rigmarole. It's not like families didn't try to see each other more, but if you weren't a US citizen or a permanent resident, for example, if your kids were in the US, how do you get that visa? Um, the Iranian passport was not, shall we say, a popular one.
Right. Well, that's a great point, loss of family. But I also want to talk about so in the novel, like we said, it's set in the 1953 coup. And the 1979 makes an appearance. Obviously, it happens, but Batman writes about it as, oh, this thing is happening. Everyone's so hopeful. I'm afraid that it's not going to be the way they think it's going to be. So it's not another catastrophic event that happens in 1979. It's more like a continuation of a catastrophe that happened in 1953. So can you tell me a little bit about it? And, since what's happened in September, since after Masa Amini, I do feel like a lot of the focus has been on everything was perfect and then 1979 happened. So can you kind of walk us through that and tell the audience what happened in 1953? Why was the feeling of loss of country for Roya and Bahman then?
Yeah, I think in the stationery shop, I particularly wanted to focus in 1953, mostly because in my first book, In Together Tea, I focused on 1979, and I explored how 1979 affected one particular family so deeply. And I didn't want to kind of write the same book again. So, in the stationery shop, 1979 kind of is part and parcel of the entire narrative, as opposed to the big blow up event that so many of us feel it was in our lived experience. In 1953, what happened was a confluence of events where you had Prime Minister Mossadegh, who was democratically elected, and I know some people now say he wasn't. Well, he was the prime minister. Let's leave it at that. And he wanted to nationalize the oil of Iran. And there were forces that were against this, namely British Petroleum, which at the time in Iran was the Anglo Iranian Oil Company. For their own reasons, they did not want this to happen. And then you had outside interference along with Iranian cooperation. Okay, I'm not blaming it entirely on outsiders. There was plenty of cooperation within, but he was ousted. There was literally a mob that descended into squares of the city on August 19th, 1953, attacked his home, such that he had to climb out a window, go down a ladder. It's stuff of like spy novels. Now, to this day, people are arguing some of, who is responsible and how much of this is true, which, I mean, even the US government has declassified documents and given an apology. But that was for the generation that was super hopeful, like Bahman and Roya, 17 years old in Tehran. I want to make a difference that I'm writing about people in Tehran. And there was a big difference between city life and maybe village life and also class. They're the middle to upper middle class. And I think that from my research and the people I spoke to, what happened in 1953 was the first taste of disillusionment and the idea that no matter how hard we try, we just can't get there. We tried. We tried so hard, and it was all destroyed overnight, and things changed. And look, I get it in retrospect when we look in hindsight. A lot of pre 1979 compared to what people are experiencing today seems better, was not perfect, and I think that needs to be said. That's my personal opinion. Culturally, people did have a ton more freedom, and thank God for that, but politically, it was still repressive.
Right. And even looking at the literacy rates by 1979, what was the literacy rate? It was like 40% or something.
I don't know the exact number, but I do know that since the revolution, that is one of the things that improved. And ironically, much as those of us who have immense heartbreak over the loss of women's rights that happened since 1979, ironically, they did become more prevalent students in colleges and universities. So we have to also admit that.
Right. There was a quote that I wanted to read in here that I thought is incredible with, like I said, this book, reading it now just seems so incredibly timing and timely. Every time it seems incredibly timely. But the quote is, "The past was always there, lurking in the corners, winking at you when you thought you'd moved on, hanging onto your organs from the inside." That really got me. That was one of those lines that really got me because I feel like, I have this language learning program right now. And since the protests, the mass amnesty happened in September, so many people have been reaching out to me, half Iranians, full Iranians, people who have never cared about Iran before, saying, I thought that part of me was like behind me. I thought we were like assimilated, but now all of a sudden I feel so Iranian. All these feelings are coming up. And I feel like it is this kind of like collective unconscious within all of us, even if we've like never thought about Iran before, even if we're comfortable, the people who have grown up here, they're comfortable, they speak English, never thought, twice about their identity. All of a sudden that past has come really lurking up. So I'm wondering if that's what you've experienced, how you've experienced the past few months, what you're hearing from people.
Yes, that quote was a popular quote from the book pre the Massa Amini tragedy, and people were attributing it to, oh, my past losses, my past loves, other things, and American audiences, international audiences. It struck a chord with everybody. But I love how you connected that to what we all have experienced since September 2022. It's exactly that. So many of us who have grown up, I'll speak for myself, in the United States, we have quote unquote succeeded. We are highly, not all of us, but for the most part, highly functional in professional jobs. And, we're very good at pushing down what traumatized us and getting on with it. Because I do think it is part of the Persian culture of our parents, at least, to be like, just stop, do not wallow, do not despair. I remember my mom would say to me, like, go wash your face and get back in the game. And this was what we did. But what the Massa Amini tragic killing unleashed was the opening of these old wounds. And we realized that maybe for decades we marched along and lived our cute little lives or our terrible lives, but we pushed away that connection. And how stunning is it? I didn't though, because I'm writing these books. And so finally I was like, oh my God, yeah, this is what I've been talking about. But for a lot of people, they didn't want to connect to that part of themselves. And I think it's stunning that no matter how long you've been out of the country, no matter how tenuous your connection is, whether you are half Iranian, a quarter Iranian, or, have parents who weren't even that much into the culture, it's stunning how visceral this reaction was. And you saw it play out in real time. I mean, you and I, we've both seen those social media clips of people protesting in Germany, for example, weeping, or what the song did, what Baroya did for us, where it just like unleashed all those emotions for us. And this is a loss from which we've never recovered. And I don't know if we ever will. I don't I don't want to depress everybody, but I don't personally think we ever will. And that doesn't mean that's a bad thing. It just means that the wound is pretty deep and the trauma is real, whether you want to admit it or not.
That's beautiful. Yeah, that's exactly been my experience with hearing about it. Even like, my aunt who she moved when she was a teenager, and she, there's been a lot of things that have happened. 2009 happened, the Green Movement. 2019 happened. 1,500 people were killed in the streets. It's just somehow this is the one that all of a sudden opened up, the voices of the people. So it's really interesting that that's happened.
I think it brought to light everything that we knew to be true, but that we wanted to maybe pretend wasn't and to move on from, you know. That, right, we wanted to believe it was maybe kind of gonna get better, and we wanted to believe that it couldn't be that bad. And those of us in the public eye who represent, whether we like it or not, Iranian Americans, I know I spent a lot of my time constantly saying to people, no, no, it's not like all the way. No, I want you to know. And then finally, it was like our abuser was front and center for the world to see. And all this pain came pouring out. And I realized, you know what, guys? Yeah, this is a truth about our patriarchal culture, whether we want to believe it or not, whether we want to talk about it or not. It
Absolutely.
has not gone away.
Absolutely. I think for me, one of the big things that happened is that, yeah, I spent years also being like, oh, Iran is amazing. It's this, it's that. But the thing that this made me realize and give me language for is that Iran is not the Islamic Republic. Like, we can still talk about how amazing Iran is, how the mountains are, the water, the beautiful people. And then we can say, but this is really messed up. And it's okay to say it's really messed up, because I feel like before, if we were trying to say this is really messed up, we felt like we were saying our culture is messed up. It's not that. It's two different things.
Yes, beautifully said. And I totally agree. Because I think in the past, we kept saying, look at the food, it's
Yeah.
so delicious. And
Yes.
the rooms are so colorful, gorgeous.
Yes.
And I kept saying not all Iranian men, which is true, but at the same time, you are correct that we can separate the two, and shouldn't we separate the two? My God, I mean, think about it. We have a culture that goes back thousands of years and a regime that's 44 years old. In my heart, I always separated them, but sometimes I think it felt difficult to explain that. But in a way, now more people know that.
Absolutely. I had another question from the reading group, and then I wanted to talk about you and your background afterwards. But they'd like to know about your research process and how you gathered stories to formulate your characters and their plot lines.
Yes, well, for my first book, for Together Tea, my research process was a little bit easier because so much of it was mining my own memories. So mine also luckily I'm a journal girl, so I've documented my life and I have journals I can go back to. But what did it feel like when the first bombs fell on Tehran? It's in my journal. What did it feel like to be in the basement bomb shelter? It's all there. But for the stationery shop, obviously, I had to talk to others, and I interviewed a lot of people. I read a lot of nonfiction books about the coup, which exist, and there's many, and you can, look them up and read them, and things like down to the minute are explained. down to the minute of what
Did you
happened.
read them in Persian or in English?
Oh, in English.
Okay. Okay.
In English, yes. Yes, I wish I can read Persian, but my education level in Persian is fifth grade level. I mean, I can read it, but no, I read them in English. But then I also tried to interview people, and I was in a position of privilege because I know a lot of people who lived through that time. And I interviewed as many people as I could, and they gave me their own accounts. Some were more helpful than others. Sometimes I got kind of like, wait, why are you writing this book? We don't want you to write this book. Don't write this book. Write about Australia. I got a lot of that. And
Australia in particular?
yeah, because I did live there, and
Okay,
uh,
okay.
that's why that came up. But a lot of my elderly relatives were like, Marjan, no, 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 don't do Iran. And, which I'm used to. But a few people really opened up, and one of them was my father. And he shared with me not just what happened during that summer, but details that were fascinating, like the kinds of shoes they were wearing, the music the kids were listening to, because you've read the book, the particular pastries in the cafe. He was adamant that I explain the elephant ear pastries, the tongue pastries, the coffees, what was playing at Cinema Metropole, and what Cinema Metropole looked like. So all of that is very real. And he kept telling me, you better get the street names right and the geography right. And he drew me maps, and I was like, okay, well, no one's gonna care. But then when it went to copy editing, the copy editor at Simon and Schuster would come back to me and say things like, "Oh, you wrote Hafez Street. It was actually Hafez Avenue."
Oh,
So all
wow.
of that was fact checked. They fact checked the geographical details, and they fact checked anything that was based on a historical event that I said, because we all want to be, even though it's fiction, that part needs to be true.
Right, right. And then the characters, are they based on people that you know, or they is there any real people in there? Actually, in the end, you mentioned Mr. Fakhri mentioned some of the couples that he got together. Were those real couples?
They're not real couples,
Okay.
but so Roya I made up.
Okay.
Roya is a character I made up. But of course, whenever you write a character, if any writer tells you it's based on absolutely no one, they're lying, because it's always going to be a composite, not just of people you know, but also of yourself. So for certain emotional scenes of Roya's, I used my own emotional bank of loss. Roya, I did technically make up, and Bahman is made up. Mr. Fakhri, so he's made up, but my dad said to me once in passing, he said, "Oh, when I was in high school, we used to go to the stationery shop where the owner would pass love letters for the teenagers in between the pages of the books so they could communicate." And I remember he told me this, and I thought, how does that not go in a novel? Are you kidding me? That's gonna be in a book. That part is true. That part is.
Well, so this interview series is called Growing Up Irooni. So I'd love to hear about your past. So you've talked a little bit about your father. So where were you born? And you lived in what, 7 countries growing up? So what were those? What was your story of growing up?
I moved a lot when I was growing up. I was born in Turkey to Iranian parents, and then we moved to Iran, and then from there we moved to Hamburg, Germany, and from there to Nairobi, Kenya, and then back to Iran. So I was in Iran right after the revolution, because people forget that there was this moment where it's like, yay, everything's going to be perfect now. People were dancing in the streets. Yeah, so we went back, and then it quickly became clear that that was not the direction the country was going in. So, and then as an adult, I moved to Switzerland and Australia. Ergo, one day I will have to write a book about Australia. Um,
Yeah. But why were you moving so much as a
I
child,
was
the
because my
pre-revolution?
pre-revolution, my dad was a diplomat. He was a diplomat, so we were assigned to a different country every 3 years, and he got very sick. So my dad he was struck with a severe autoimmune disease when I was a year old, and he progressively got worse. And so sometimes his assignments got shorter and shorter, and then eventually he retired pretty young because he was quite sick. Um, but that's why I moved when I was little, and then I swore that I would marry someone who never moved. And so the first thing I did out of college is I married someone who moved a lot. And so with him, I've moved plenty. Yeah, so
Why does he move a lot?
for his job, well, right now we've been in Massachusetts for almost 15 years, which is the longest I've lived anywhere. But he was moving a ton, and I finally put an end to that.
Okay, well, we'll get to that in a bit, but then what language did you grow up speaking? What was your relationship with Iranian culture as you were growing up?
I think my relationship with Iranian culture was stronger because we moved so much. My parents felt a deep desire to keep us knowing the culture because the outside culture was always so different. So, whether I was in Germany or Kenya or the United States, the home I came to after the end of a school day was a very Irooni home. We spoke Persian. We spoke Persian to my
And how
parents.
many siblings do you have?
I have one sister. She's 3 years older.
You spoke Persian to each other back then?
We did when we were little, and then it evolved into English. And as we got older, and to this day, it's a little weird at our dinner table, but when we speak to our parents, we speak Persian. When we speak to one another, we speak English. It's just a comfort zone. I can obviously speak Persian to my sister, but we communicate in English. But we communicate to our parents in Persian. And we ate Persian food, and we listened to Iranian music, and read Persian poetry. And my parents were very much just naturally steeping us in the culture. And I never thought it was all that strange. I was so used to straddling different cultures, especially because I'd moved so much. So, you learn to code switch. It's like, oh, if I go to my American friend's house to this day and they say, "Oh, would you like something to eat?" I quickly do the switch. I say, "Oh, if I say no, I will be starving."
Yes, I had to learn that the hard way in college. It took a really long time. I would just always be the one sitting there without water and thirsty. What did to do? But then you went to school and that you went to college in the United States. Is that right?
Yeah. Oh, I came to the U.S. when I was in fifth grade. So I went to PS 144 in Queens, New York. I am a Queens girl, truly. I can, when I get angry, the accent comes out. It's really interesting. I went to high school in Manhattan, and then college, Berkeley, California, and then grad school. My grad school is another straddling of two cultures because I did an MBA and a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing at the same time.
Okay, not in Australia.
Not in Australia. Then I went to Australia. Then I went to Australia. It's a lot of juggling different cultures, but I think it was great training to be a writer because as writers, what we want is to focus on the particular and through that make it universal. And I knew from such a young age that even though the outfits or the language or what people eat or the politics may be different in different countries or continents, the human dynamics are exactly the same. They're always the same. So whether I was wearing, my Rusari and Rupush in Iran in the playground, and then Queens, New York, very different outward setting, there was always the mean girl, there was always the teacher's pet. The dynamics between people is the same.
Right. And then what drew you to writing stories so particularly about Iran? Have you written other things as well, or is it usually centered around the Iranian experience?
So far, it's always been the Iranian experience, much to the disappointment of certain relatives because they'd love for me to write about not Iran because they're always worried, always worried. right? I mean, rightfully so.
Exactly, exactly. And then what culture is your husband from?
He's Iranian American.
Oh, is he?
He's
Okay.
Iranian American. And I think that is super helpful because we have the same background there and the same familiarity, though all kinds of things work out. So I'm just saying that's my experience. But what made me want to be a writer is that I always read. I read. I was a bookworm, and all the things we say to kids now when they're on their phones, like put that down, look up, be with us. It's going to ruin your eyes. You're hunching. That was all said to me with the books. I was always reading. And I think the cake was baked because those books that I read when I was, whether it was in the basement in Iran, literally during the war, or once I moved to the US, the books saved me. They always saved me. And they were my one constant. And I deep down always wanted to be a writer, but it was not a vocation that was available to the daughter of immigrants who had sacrificed so much.
Right, right. So how is your family feel about your parents in particular? How did they feel about what you do now? I mean, you've had a lot of success, so that helps. But
Yeah, they're happy now. They're happy now because I've had success. But when I wasn't successful, they were not terribly into it. I think the idea was, look, do this as a hobby. This is a great side gig, but please, please have a real profession, a real profession with an income that's stable. And I get it because uh, immigrants have given up a lot, and I think they want to rebuild some sense of stability and security in the new country. And I'm not alone in that, which is why there's so many Indian doctors and engineers and Iranian doctors and. But it was almost like a coming out when I finally.
wow. You had to hide it. Yeah.
I was always like, yes, I'm doing this on the side and I'm getting my MBA, even though I don't like finance and I don't understand accounting. But yes, I'm here and I'm doing it. And then there came a kind of time when I realized, big breath, this is who I am, and let the chips fall where they may. And
Right, definitely.
I've heard it all. Please let me tell you, if any of your listeners are wannabe artists or writers, you sometimes people say to me, "Are you, ever upset if anybody on Goodreads or Amazon, get tons of reviews there? If anybody says anything slightly negative, do you get hurt?" I'm like, "Oh." I have Iranian relatives, and they're very upfront and honest. So,
Right. Well, one thing that I've really come to understand with, having this podcast and having the kinds of work that I do is that I feel like Iranians, the first, and I think a lot of it has to do with, past trauma and all this stuff, but the first thing that they do is criticize. Like they'll pick the one thing that doesn't agree with them in what you've done, and they just talk about that first. Like, and I always tell them, the reason that American culture is so like they accomplish so much is that from that time they're very, very little, their parents say, "Oh, good job. Here's a certificate. You did great." And they just keep encouraging them until they become good. That is how you become good. Whereas in our culture, they just say, "Just quit. Just quit."
that is so funny. That is so funny you say that. I've thought about this a lot, and my husband is a runner, and he always tells the story. He tells the story when he was running his first New York City marathon. He's running, it's hard, everybody's cheering, and all the other people on the sidelines are like, "You can do it, go!" And then his mom's like, "Biyo birun!"
that's,
Why should he? And it's
that's exactly.
yeah, yeah, I know, and it's I get it, but at the same time, to be fair, I want to be fair. I've had so many Iranians reach out to me, thanking me for representing the culture, thanking me for letting them see themselves on the page and for writing about these issues. So there is that too. But yes, sometimes I joke, like, I think in our American parenting, and I'm an American parent in my parenting, we're like, good standing, good breathing.
Yeah. None of that in Iranian culture.
Mm-mm,
Well, so speaking of parenting, so you're married to an Iranian American. Can he speak Persian? Does
mm-hmm.
he? Okay. So what about the kids? How have y'all navigated that with your children?
Layla, this is a case study for you as a
Yes,
Persian language
I love
teacher.
it.
Um, so we're both Iranian American, and for the most part, we speak English. We can obviously speak Persian to each other. We started off speaking Persian to both kids so they would learn it.
Yes.
And my daughter is fluent. She can read and write it because she also went to the Saturday Persian language schools, and was determined to learn it. My son understands but doesn't speak it as well, but he understands and he can speak a little bit. And the Persian language school coincided with soccer, so we had to make a choice. But it is fascinating to me that my daughter speaks Persian fluently because I feel like that's an act of God. Even though we spoke to her when she was little, once she got older, it's easier for me to speak Persian to little kids, but if we're discussing is there a God, I have to switch to English. I just don't have the vocabulary. And yes, so it's wonderful. She does have, the super duper American accent when she speaks it. But that's okay. I mean, she
Yes.
speaks it.
Right. And then do you like Nowruz and all that kind of stuff in the house as well? Eat Iranian food?
Oh, eat Iranian food all the time. Like that.
Do you think it's important? I mean, yeah, any of it. Do you think the language is important to teach kids at this point? Like you said, your husband and you can speak English fluently. Why is it important for your daughter to know Persian and your son?
I just think, what a richness. What a privilege to be able to speak Persian. And it's a connection not just to their grandparents and their other relatives, but it's a connection to a past that they may think they don't have, but they have it. Just like you quoted that line, the past is always there, lurking, on the inside. And that's not just your own personal past. It's, I believe, generational also. And I think when you have a language like Persian where so much classic poetry is written in Persian, then it's an extra beautiful plus to speak it. So we tried with both kids, we spoke exclusively Persian until they went to school, but then we had to switch up. The food, who wouldn't want to eat Iranian food? It's like the best.
Yeah.
Like, it's my preference. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like even if I wasn't Iranian, that's the kind of food I like. A very fragrant. I love the sweet and the tart. It's
I love the Iranian food that comes up in the book where she cooks for Walter, her American husband.
yes.
I was thinking it'd be fun to use her little, there's a really nice pages long description of her making this khoresh. I was thinking it'd be fun to do that for for my videos. I love doing that.
I know it kind of became a little recipe there.
Totally.
But I love Walter. Walter is one of my favorite characters, and people think sometimes mistakenly that Roya loved Bahman more. Not in my mind. I think she loved them equally in different ways, and I think we have more than one soulmate. That's also another discussion we can have. Um, but yeah, the food, Nowruz, definitely we celebrate Nowruz. In fact, it's so funny because when my kids were little, I went out of my way to celebrate Nowruz so that they had the culture. And then now that they're older, I guess there was a part of me this past year because my daughter wasn't even in Boston, she was in New York, and I thought, oh, I can kind of get away without doing a half seat. And then she's like, you taught us to celebrate Nowruz. You are making a half. You know what I'm saying? It's like I almost did it too well. So yeah, it's I'm in it now for the long.
I can imagine it's the same with like a Christmas tree or something,
Yes,
it's just something that
yes.
I
Where
can
the kids are like, "What do you mean you're not gonna?" Yeah.
yeah, it's a sense of loss of like home if there's not a Christmas tree in your family house when you grow up. Well, that's wonderful. Well, I think that that's all of my questions. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd still like to talk about?
I want to say thank you to you because I've made I've made I've suggested to both of my children to follow you on Instagram, and I just want you to know this is from the heart. And if you know me, you know that I say things like this and people think it's sappy, but I'm sorry, that's who I am. What you have done is given them this entire gift, this generation, where they have access to the Persian language and to the Persian culture in a way that's easy for them and familiar and not overwhelming. And I want to thank you for that. I'm not speaking right now as Marjan the writer, I'm speaking as Marjan the mom. Thank you for doing that for Gen Z, and for all of us, but
Thank you.
especially them. I think it's such a gift. I didn't have anything like this growing up, nothing. And so it, for me to be able to say, my daughter, you get on Chai and Conversation, you see that, you know what I'm saying? Like it's just, it's a privilege that we have, and you work so hard. So thank you.
Well, thank you. That means a lot to me, and I feel like it's a continuation of my mother's work and you know, everyone who's like come before us, and I really felt that reading this actually it really made me want to talk to my mom more and get more stories from her and just made me very emotional about that and just thinking about continuing her work and how language is so important to us to connect with our families. I love that this conversation started talking about families, and I feel like this is a really important way for us to connect with our families and for the past generations. So whatever I can do to contribute to that uh, makes me happy because I feel like that makes our bonds a lot stronger.
It does. And those of us who are a little bit older, we know that time's running out to connect to our parents. I feel that in a very visceral way, with my dad being sick and everything. And so I write at the end of the acknowledgments of the stationery shop. It was all an excuse to talk to him.
Oh yeah, where does he live now?
In New York.
Okay.
But normally if I called him and he said, "Oh, everything's great. Here's your mother," and then this book was an excuse for saying, "Hey, wait a sec. Yeah, can you tell me about the cafes when you were 17?" Yeah.
That's so lovely. That's so wonderful. And your mom is there too in New York as well?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And they've been married for how many years now? Probably.
They have been married. It will be 57 years this summer.
That's incredible. Well, I think this is a very yeah, your parents shine through this story as well, and I feel like it's such a nice tribute to them. And so I feel like that connection with my work as well. Just a
Yeah.
tribute
Isn't
to our
that why we're
parents.
doing it? Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. My mom also was like, you got to get your architecture degree. What are you doing? And I somehow managed to weasel my way into doing this work instead. But
Well, we're all the better for it. So
wonderful. Well, thank you so much for talking with me today. It was so wonderful to connect with you. I really appreciate it.
thank
And
you.
and
Thank
like I said, I want everybody to read this book. So we'll link to the book. And where can people find out more about you or connect with you?
Well, you can connect with me on my well, you can't connect with me on my website. You can find out more about just marjankamali.com, or follow me on Instagram, which is something I'm supposed to say. I'm always bad about saying. I'm Marjan Kamali 7. And once upon a time I would have said Twitter, but who knows? So
That's right. That's right. My husband just discovered Twitter and I was like, it's done, man.
yeah,
You're
I
too
know.
late.
It's like discovering Rome after the fall, right? Like, not that it was ever that great, but yeah.
Well, wonderful. Well, we'll link to all that and you can read the book. And Marjan Kamali, thank you so much for talking with
Thank
me.
you. Thank you. Bye.